it went on. I mean, here's the National Post again. This is an editorial. Israel's opponents, this is Gaza, have mastered such techniques as digging up graves and stealing bodies from mortuaries to inflate the carnage on the ground, and much of the Western media has reported casualty figures uncritically. There has never, ever, in the 34 years I've reported in wars on the ground throughout the Middle East, ever been a case of people digging up corpses. They don't need to. The fresh corpses are witness enough. They're all real. But this stuff gets in the paper. How can you sit in Toronto and read this in the Globe and Mail? It's a letter to the editor, and it's printed. The bleating and crying from Gaza reminds one of petulant children who, after repeatedly poking a large dog with a stick, are upset to learn that it bites. It's the first time I've seen anyone call Israel a dog, but anyway, that's the story they went with. There was one thing that came out of Gaza journalistically, which I think was remarkable, and in journalistic terms only, because there was so much blood drenched all over it, you can't say any other phrase, was a success. And that was, for the first time, English language newspapers and French and Italian and Spanish language newspapers used Palestinian reporters inside Gaza to report their own story. Previously, there'd been stringers, guys who added a few words. Well, medical authorities say that the dead were militants, whatever it may be. But suddenly, we needed them to report for us. And one day, our own correspondent, a stringer, by the way, I don't know if you use the same phrase in the United States, it's a reporter who doesn't work full-time for a paper, but whose reports are accepted and printed on the basis that he's paid according to how much he sends, i.e. it's lineage. And Faraz Akram was and is our Palestinian correspondent in Gaza. And he rang my head office in London and talked to Catherine Butler, our foreign editor, in tears one day to say that his father had just been killed by the Israelis. And she said, Faraz, write it. Just write it. Speak it over the phone. It'll be on page 1. This is the story for tonight's paper. I'm sorry, you've got to write the story of your father. And so that night, we carried, the only paper of its kind in Britain to do so, The Death and Life of My Father. This was our headline for our readers in the morning. I'll read you just a few paragraphs in the beginning and then the very end to show you that this is journalism of a very high quality. The phone call came at around 4:20 on Saturday. A bomb had been dropped on the house at our small farm in northern Gaza. My father was walking from the gate to the farmhouse at the time. It was our beloved place, that farm, and its 2-story white house with a red roof. Nestled in a flat, fertile agricultural plain northwest of Beit Lahia, it had lemon groves, orange and apricot trees, and we had recently acquired 60 dairy cows. It was the closest farm to the northern border with Israel. Ironically, we always thought that the biggest danger there was not from Israeli troops, who usually went straight past if they were mounting an incursion, but from stray Hamas rockets aimed at the Israeli towns north of us. But shortly before sunset on Saturday, as Israeli ground troops and tanks invaded Gaza in the name of shutting down Hamas rocket sites, the peace of that place was shattered and my father's life extinguished at the age of 48. He was, by the way, not a Hamas member. He was working for the Palestinian Authority as a judge. A well-educated man, spoke beautiful, fluent English, almost without an accent. Warplanes and helicopters had swept in, bombing and firing to open up the space for the tanks and ground forces that would follow in the darkness. It was one of those F-16 airstrikes that killed my father. The house was reduced to little more than powder, and of Dad there was nothing much left either. Just a pile of flesh, my uncle, who found him in the rubble, said later with brutal honesty. And Faraz ends his story. His wife is very pregnant and, in fact, gave birth to a child 3 days later. He carries, of course, his father's name, his grandfather's name. He ends his report, "My grief carries no desire for revenge, which I know to be always in vain. But in truth, as a grieving son, I'm finding it hard to distinguish between what the Israelis call terrorists and the Israeli pilots and tank crews who are invading Gaza. What is the difference between the pilot who blew my father to pieces and the militant who fires a small rocket? I have no answers, but just as I am about to become a father, I have lost my father." Now that is real journalism. That was a journalistic success within the horror of Gaza, that we actually found someone who could come forward and write like that. You didn't read that in the New York Times. I'm amazed when I read even letters from soldiers, US Marines, when families send them to me from here, from America, how eloquent they are in describing what goes on in Iraq and Afghanistan. Not in the WikiLeaks way, which is all raw material, although one of those reports, which was the email account of the Taliban, they're over the wire. Do you remember that when they were coming into their base in Afghanistan? That was pretty dramatic. But the eloquence which I look for in newspaper, and which I think probably we all do, is not there. We feed you with our cliches. We don't give you an emotion. My view is that the job of a foreign, well, Amira Haas, who's one of my heroines, not heroes, heroines, I still believe that feminine nouns exist. Amira and I once had a debate. She works, as most of you know, for Haaretz, and is a brilliant and brave reporter, putting all American reporters to shame in her coverage of the occupation of the West Bank. She and I had this discussion about what was the job of a foreign correspondent. And me, being a Brit, of course, I said, well, to be first, witness to history, writing the truth, blah, blah, blah. And she said, no, Robert, our job is to monitor the centers of power, especially when they want to go to war, and especially when they want to use lies to do it. That's an Israeli reporter, and she's dead right. Best definition I've ever heard of what a foreign correspondent, I was going to say should be. And she writes with passion and eloquence. But that's not what we want. You don't ever read Amira Haas in America. You can't, because it would rub up and frictionalize against all the reporting that you have to read here, which frankly I don't think works. I don't believe it. People here have not gone to the internet, I think, because they want newspapers on the cheap. That may be what's happened in Europe. British, Italian, French newspapers are not bad on the Middle East. After American press, that doesn't say a lot, but they're pretty good. I think here people in America have gone to the internet because they don't believe newspapers anymore. They believe they're being told lies, that it is being a kind of misshaped, cliche-ridden version of a government authority. I've read many times in America before huge extracts from the LA Times. Government officials say, according to official sources, according to intelligence sources, as if the newspaper should be called government officials say. Cut the reporter out. It's not there anymore. And I'm afraid, it was Cy Hirsch, when I was talking to him on the phone from Paris not so long ago, I know him personally quite well, and who said to me, you don't get brownie points in the New York Times for rocking the boat. He made the point, too, there aren't many members of the New York Times staff who have relatives serving in the US forces in Iraq or Afghanistan. This is East Coast society there. And I think there is not only a detachment from reality, which you are kept well away from, but there's a detachment from reality on the part of the journalists, most but not all of whom have no connection with the military until, and their use of the word says it all, they are embedded in the military.